Hey everyone, and welcome to the Four Pillars of Post, Part 2 Sound. My name is Nikki Coble. I'm the director of Catalyst Story Institute, and I'm here today with post production extraordinaire Justin Joseph Hall from Quatre-Vents. Justin, we're so excited to have you here today. We know that you've had the opportunity to work for companies like PBS, HBO, Major League Baseball, National Geographic, and NBCUniversal as I split my attention between you and what I'm reading. Thank you for being here. It is so exciting to have you back and to take us through why sound is so important.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that, Nikki, and thank you to Catalyst. As always, happy to be here. As I really love this community. But the reason why it's important is because bad sound is the most glaring thing that shouts out to executives that you don't know what you're doing, that you don't understand what distracts an audience. And so, a lot of people say sound first and then visual second, because really, if you can tell a story with the audio, you're more than halfway there. That's the hardest part. Even when I am editing, let's say a documentary, and we're writing as we're going, always cutting for sound first. Even in complicated verite stuff, um, that's the most important thing. And if you can't knock that out of the park, as you probably are going to be ignored by the people that you finally got their attention to watch this thing. So
Right. Isn't that key that you can use it first in terms of syncing sound and things like that when you go through your past and see what you got on the day, that you're using that as a first point of elimination to say the sound is rotten here, this we can't use or we can't fix, right?
yeah, and you don't want to throw if you can't do anything about the sound and it's terrible in the end, you can always throw up subtitles if it ruins the story. But it is definitely a consideration. Uh, if the sound is awful, you should be considering much less likely to use it if you don't get it on set. Now, that's saying the only thing that you really need to have from set is the recorded dialogue. And you can redo that. It's just very expensive. For a pilot, you're probably not going to be able to do that unless you actually got studio money to make your pilot. Um, but that's really the only thing you need from set. Everything else is going to be built afterwards. It's not like, unless you're obviously, shooting a live orchestra and you want to have the violin in sync or something like that in the scene. Or if you're doing Whiplash, if you're going to do all that afterwards, that's going to be a pain to match the drumming. Um,
Mhm.
but most of the time, it's just the dialogue that's important to capture on set. So, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's important because it's a visceral thing. We talked about this in part one editing as well. As viewers or as human beings, we can detect in milliseconds that something isn't being honest with us, that something is off, that something is not
Hmm.
aligned, whether it's the sound or whether it's the edit that, in the edit, it's the person's jaw that doesn't sync up with what the dialogue that we're hearing as we look over a dirty medium shot over the shoulder or something. It's those things that just viscerally go, I don't believe this and I don't know why, or I don't respond to this and I don't know why. And so all those things are so key in terms of keeping the audience on the ride, even in the first 30 seconds of what they're watching.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things that is distracting that's not like real life, if you capture sound poorly and don't hire a professional to capture your sound, is that what you hear is, especially like through camera sound and bad microphones, is the background audio is much louder than you would hear it in the real world. So I'm sitting here. Well, we'll do a little like thought experiment later, but um, I can hear the fan of my computer and different things. Um, but if you just have like a cheap mic that's capturing all that and it's sitting across the room, in order to hear me talk, it's also going to bring all those other sounds up. And so that's why it's important to isolate each sound. And so one of the first things that you should do when you're setting up a project is communicate about how you're going to organize the audio and talk to your sound recordist. Are they going to use a boom or a lav? Are they going to use both? Both is definitely preferable. People have huge preferences, and the boom can sound more natural somewhat, but it picks up more sound around. And the lav gets a lot lower sounds because it's close to the body. So I always prefer like a lav. There's a lot of producers and different people that always tell me to do boom. And actually, in the end, you end up sending, and this is one reason to talk to the mixer, see what they use before you start. You should talk to the sound recordist and the final sound mixer that you're going to use. Sometimes they put those two together and use the best parts of both and print them together. And that's where you get that really cinematic sound sometimes. At least to me, that reminds me of the cinema. It's when they do that sort of imprinting of two different, when you get two mics that are great, that sound, get a different part of the voice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting too, because we don't even think of it. Listening and hearing are two different things. So as a human being, when you're listening, you're engaged, it's intentional, right? When you're hearing everything, you hear a lot of things during the day, even just working from your desk. You could hear construction outside, you could hear somebody walking by, you can hear a
Mhm.
conversation on the phone behind the wall or whatever that is. But we tune a lot of things out. And in terms of our experience, our auditory experience of any content that we're viewing, someone has done that for us. Someone has turned those levels down, turned these levels up, said, focus on this, or this thing is on the right side of the room, this thing is on the left side of the room, in our visceral and auditory experience of how we're experiencing the story. So it's key to
Yeah.
listen to that in your production as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think right now, I'll do a little later, but I think if everybody listening, if they take a break right now and just listen for 10 or 15 seconds and try to name as many things that you hear around you. It's obviously going to be different for everybody in the room. But let's just be quiet for 10, 15 seconds. And then I'll just list off a bunch of the things that I hear in my silent room, you know.
A pause.
Well, I got to say, I don't know if that was 15 seconds, but it felt like it.
It felt
Um,
like it was a moment of zen.
Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that.
That's what we
Um,
call a room tone, right?
yeah, exactly, and that's why you do it. And I'll get to why you get room tone later. And this is, you need to listen to your sound person. They're just as important as the DP on set. They just don't need as much time a lot of the times to do what they do. Um, so I mean, here I am actually in a fairly quiet environment, but I still hear. I oddly enough have a bunch of machines to the left of me here. There's my computer that has a fan in it. There's this hard drive that has a fan, and it's also clicking every once in a while. There's a dog outside that was barking. There's multiple trucks that are coming across. I mean, one other thing, this really was a very silent room to do it. You often hear air conditioner. If you're near a fridge, you hear that. You might hear somebody working in the kitchen. And those are all the things that you can or cannot put in your film. They all can be distracting, or they all might not be. But every room that you go into, that's one of the things a sound designer or a sound mixer is going to be thinking about and putting in your film, or having the option to put in your film, to make it feel more real, because you're never in complete silence. The only time that you would ever be in complete silence is if you're in outer space, because there's no molecules for the sound to travel out there, which I think in 2001 Space Odyssey, I think that you hear an example of that. But other than that, you're wherever you are, it's a real choice to take out all of those sounds and just to hear dialogue, or just to hear footsteps walking down the hall and nothing else, or just to hear music flowing. That really feels ethereal. I think is the best word to kind of describe it.
Mhm.
So, as a director or producer, you want to have those kind of conversations. What kind of feel do you want in each of your scene, in each room that you're in? What would you be hearing? What do you want to hear? What's annoying? Like, if you have a washing machine going in the other room, doesn't mean you need to put it in your film. Well, hopefully you're not doing it while you're shooting, but
Right. You never know. Sometimes it is
yeah,
me.
you don't have to be absolutely realistic, but you're a lot of times feigning realism in a lot of this stuff. So, and you really hear in the really what you think of cinematic, you hear that fleshed out more. A lot people talk a lot about Christopher Nolan's sound design because he spends a lot of time doing it. And Star Wars and things, they fill out a lot of those special kind of sounds in the background.
I do think
Anyway, I
there's.
jumped. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit with that, but I think that's really important. And um, the when you are communicating and what you're doing, it's not just communicating what you want everything to sound like. It's also communicating in post production. If you are an editor or working a little bit in post production, or if you're producing post at all, you should make sure that your editor is organized with their tracks and it corresponds with something that a mixer can do. So what does that mean? That basically means don't mix voiceover with music on the same track. You want to keep them very separate. And this is one reason why we professional editors do not like Final Cut X, because they kind of take this away. You have to do a lot of work around, or you have to set it up very weird in order to organize it like this. But you often have like a track for voiceover, a track for production audio, or a lot of times it's like 20 tracks for production audio, a lot, because you have multiple mics on set, right? You might have four to 16 tracks of sound effects, depending on what you're doing. And then you have music separated. So it's really like 4 or 5 categories that you want to make sure that it's strict and ready to go, because that being good and organized with your stuff is going to keep sound costs down. And we all want costs to be down in order to make our pilot the best.
Yes, we do.
The other thing that I want to say is, if you're making a pilot and going to executives, you may not need to go to a mix in the end. So if that's the case, you kind of need to talk to your and know probably the work of your editor and what kind of sound they can do. When we went and pitched the show that got Axios, that got picked up by HBO, I did the sound mix just with a simple compressor. And if you don't know what a compressor is, don't worry about it right now. Just the one effect on the track that kind of leveled everything off just enough. And everybody was mic'd really well. And if you have all that in place, and you don't really need a sound mixer to make it sound perfect like you really want a final product to be, it's okay, because the executives know that what things are going to be like when they're finished. They watch rough cuts all day of shows that they've already picked up, and those are never mixed until the end. So as long as you can understand what's going on, it's totally fine. And if you can't understand audio, again, feel free to use subtitles to help that out. You also don't have to go crazy with sound effects, but you do want to have the essential ones. The more that you can put into stuff, sound is really not that expensive to spend a day. Spend a day doing sound on 20 minutes of footage can really enhance a lot. Mm-hmm. And keeping things subtle is kind of smart with that, or with extra sound effects. So I just want to kind of mention that ahead of time, especially since we're talking about pilots and pitching a lot. So
of course. And you were talking about room tone as well, simply because those things that we hear that we tune out, the AC in the summertime, you're shooting in the summertime, mm-hmm. You're like, oh God, this room is so hot. I'm so glad we have the AC on. But you have to turn it off. There will be a hum that you cannot splice in and out of the thing. You could sort of reduce and put a little bit of a reduction on a hum like that. But it's one of those things that is going to affect, it's going to be married to the dialogue if you're not careful, depending on how you're recording it. And one of the tricks that I remember loving from one of the DPs that I worked with is anytime he unplugged, if we were at a restaurant or in somebody's home, he unplugged any kind of refrigerator. That's where he put his car keys. So he would remember to plug it back in before he left. So his car keys would always go in the fridge. And I was like, that's a good move, because you would hate to be able to be in a restaurant and have a certain amount of time you could turn off a freezer or anything like that, and they could lose a lot of value, and that would be very expensive for them to lose the things that you have let go warm in that space. So keys in the fridge, if I can offer one piece of advice.
Yeah, that's good. I'd like that. And one of the main reasons why you can't have a lot of background noises, aside from it's hard to separate them. You want to have your noise floor as far down as possible, because a lot of times you put in all of that ambient sound afterwards. People go and record the fridge by itself, or record a room by itself, and then you put in a bed underneath. A lot of times it's a lot I'll try not to, I have a way of rambling a little bit or going off into a
So do
specific
I.
thing. But but one thing that sound mixers do too is um, there's these things called overtones, or they're not the main part of the sound, but they're a lot higher than the main sound that you hear. Um, some of those specific overtones, they can be different for everybody, and for every kind of sound. Instruments have specific overtones and harmonics. They're also called harmonics. They're very similar. Um, they blend in with a lot of different things. So it's not even if like there's a woman speaking and then there's a really low hum in the background. That really low hum in the background might not match exactly with a woman speaking with like a high voice, but the overtones might overlap. And
Mhm.
then you can't do as much with that other stuff because you're getting all this other noise that's when you're trying to amplify the voice, you get this other junk with it. So that's one main reason why you need that um, separation.
Right,
Um,
anytime something is baked in together, you can't raise the
undo
volume on the
it.
voice and lower the volume or the pitch of either thing because they're married, and if one goes up, the other goes up, or one goes down, the other goes down.
Yeah, and there's ways to separate them, but there's always a cost to that, and it can sound fake. The other reason why we go and get room tone in a place is yes, we do often create beds of, and you probably won't be able to do this with a lot of pilots or pitches where you're not going to have a mix, you're not going to even do this stuff. But room tone, um, a lot of times you're cutting dialogue, and there are spaces in between the dialogue because you want to have a pause between this, or you need more space between their thoughts so that the audience can take it in between, or for whatever reason there's a space in the audio dialogue. Maybe somebody hit a pot and you want to keep their uh, or there was a loud noise in between the lines and you need to cut
Hmm.
the background noise out because it's really distracting. um, you get that room tone so you can replace that, and you don't notice that um, even the hum of my fan or my computer, which is on if we're recording this right now, that doesn't disappear all of a sudden. Because when you're in a room, if everything shuts off, you can hear that. If your computer fan's going the whole time and then all of a sudden it's out and then it's back in 2 seconds later.
Yeah, it becomes a little band-aid that can
Yeah.
sew all of that stuff together. For us, when we were filming in practical locations, there was a dry cleaner next door, and we didn't realize their hours of operation because we went in at night to do the location check at the wine store. So there was no operation next door. But then the dry cleaners was functioning the next day, in which case you're hearing all
Mm,
the machinery and cars are going off on the street because you're right on the sidewalk in New York City at the storefront. So things like that, if you want to cut that part out because you really have to use that take, you have to have the consistency
yeah,
to fill in those holes.
and that's a good point. Like if the sound changes, something happens where you get like the air conditioner comes on, or anything comes on the next day or halfway through your shoots, that means you need a separate room tone. And usually you take it after the scene. So if it comes on in the middle, that's kind of too bad. Or if it goes away, it's also kind of can be a problem. Um, so yeah. Anyway, um, room tone's a little boring. It's even boring to talk about, but
I
it's
know, right?
important. Is what
But it's a
what we're trying to
staple.
say.
And I
That's
think
right.
too, it's something like you said, if cost is the bottom line, so often we come to the end of our shoot and go, oh wow, we needed a 20% buffer that we didn't account for, and now we're heading toward post with smaller coffers than we thought. The way that you scout your locations, how far are we from the subway,
Mm-hmm.
how far are we from an active street,
Mm-hmm.
what are the businesses on either side of the business or underneath or above the business, what's going to affect our shoot that we're going to end up adding cost to later.
Exactly. Yeah, pay attention. And like, if you can't shoot when an airplane's going by and there's an airplane coming by every 15 minutes, you're going to waste a lot of time on set. So that's going to cost you money. So,
Thank you for that, Bodhi. This is so key. I know Bodhi's doing a lot of his own work and finding these finding these important gems along the way himself.
yeah. Yeah, and I think the main thing is the sound person usually doesn't go on the scouting. So as a producer, as a director, you should be paying attention to those things. As a cinematographer, you should be paying attention to those things. A lot of times people forget that stuff, but that should be number one. The other thing I should say though, on the other hand, when you're there, bring um I'm completely going off of my outline, but it's okay. Um I just, I'm always like organized, and then I'm like, oh, I should do this later, but now I'm just rambling again. But
It's
anyway,
okay. It's all good. It's a plot twist.
um,
It's a spontaneous now and for the first time conversation.
that's right. This is live here. Um, but the other thing is when you do go scouting, if you have a recorder, and I should show you the one that I bring everywhere that I go, something like this. The Zoom is very popular. It fits in any bag that you have, whatever. And this can record anything. It's very high quality microphone. Um, when you go on the scout, record the sounds that you like that you hear, because there's nobody around there when you're scouting, right? You can go and record a stream. I mean, we were outside of the Yosemite and there's these mountains and beautiful birds and there were wild turkeys and stuff. We got some of that and it's in my short film prologue that we used. It's really fun to go listen to sounds, and it can save you a lot later. And that way it feels more real. Like if you're shooting in Missouri, I'm assuming most of your guys' production offices aren't in Missouri. They're gonna have there are people who actually complain about the kind of birds that you have put in your film. So if you put a random bird that doesn't live in Missouri, you're not gonna have that problem if you know that you recorded the sound of birds while you're there. Or
Mhm.
and there's a film where I've had to put in a million bird sounds for a documentary that we did a while back, and that took time, to make sure that I get the right birds from the right region and make sure that you have those kind of sound effects and all that stuff. So look for the opportunities, the golden gems when you are scouting to record those sounds and put it into a library, or especially if you're a director or have an extra day for the audio person to be there. It might cost a little bit of money, but it can add a lot to your film.
Of course. And hopefully, someone that you're working with may have a library of their own
Hmm.
or know
Definitely.
where you can acquire that sound. If you never went to Missouri, but you were filming somewhere that could mimic Missouri, well, then you're
Hmm.
going to have to pay for that sound to be
Yeah.
part of the use of your content in perpetuity.
And I'll tell you something that maybe I shouldn't say, but if the sound effect is blended in the background with everything that you do, if you have it, you might not have to pay for it. If you can audibly tell what's going on, you you likely are going to have to pay for it. And it depends if you get libraries. But I would always pull sound effect libraries everywhere. We talk about a lot of times we talk about with producers and who wants to take risks and who doesn't with sound effects. It's better not to, obviously. For a pilot, it doesn't matter, right?
Hmm.
So if you find like you're on a project and you have a sound effect library that you're using for something, take that and bring it to the next time that you're doing a pilot and you don't have money to, you don't have the whole library with you. Sound doesn't take up as much space on your computer as like stock footage.
Right.
It's like having a music library with you. You carry that along with you. Um, that also being said, I'm just going to jump back to some technical stuff here. What you don't want is pulling stuff off YouTube. You don't want to use MP3s in any form. There's really only two file formats that are high quality sound that is commonly used, and that's WAV. We call it WAV. Or, sorry, I just combined the two. WAVE, and then
Did you say wave?
AI.
It's
Yeah, I
a
said
wave.
WAVE.
It's a delicate little thing.
and AIF is that's how I pronounce it. AIFF or AIF. It's saved both ways. Um, it's basically Windows versus Apple. They both work the same. Um, those are the main ones that you if you see them, you should keep them and use them for things. But yeah, um,
So using WAV and AIF formats and
yep,
not MP3
yeah, because
or anything.
they're uncompressed, and that means that they MP3s take away the unaudible the sounds that are not audible above 20 kilohertz and below 20 kilohertz. Um, 200, anyway. It's both of them are 20 numbers. One's in the thousands and one's like 20. But those are the parts that you can't hear even as a young person.
Mhm.
But they might take out other things depending on the compression settings, because the compressions for MP3s are variable. So anyway, you don't want to use those. Don't use MP3 if you can avoid it. Let's also just chat quickly. The other thing that's really important, always clap. You're going to waste a lot of time if you don't. You might throw away audio, because if you're in a rush, I know I would never do this, but there are editors, especially if they're not getting paid a lot and you're making a pilot or doing whatever, that would go quickly. If you don't have an easy way to sync things, if you don't have an assistant editor who's like knows what they're doing, and you don't clap, have a clap sync point for the visual and audio to connect together, it can take a very, very long time to sync those things, depending on what you're shooting. You have to be able to see and hear something clearly. And hopefully it's right at the beginning of when you turn on the camera, because if you don't have that, then you have to search for something throughout. And searching for something visually isn't that hard a lot of times. But searching for it audibly when you just see waveforms is very
Yep.
difficult. And so you might have to, if you're recording a 40-minute interview, or maybe that's a bad example, but like 40 minutes of something, like a scene where you're walking through the woods or whatever in a reality TV show, and you have to listen to 40 minutes to find a sync point, that's obviously a huge waste of time and money.
Right. And you sync it all up front, do you not? I mean, for me, that was a
Always.
huge key, was that the
Yes.
first process is not you just get in there and start picking shots and then sync your audio. No, no, no. You have to
No.
make a library of, oh, wow, for some reason we didn't get take 8 sound, so I can't now use this, and I have to know that this one doesn't have, and I have a log
Mm-hmm.
of the things that don't sync up. I think for us, we had 20 episodes. It was about 99 minutes of footage in real time, and there were 550 things that had to get sunk up with all of our
Mm-hmm.
takes. And so that is its own process before you get to the process that you care about, which is choosing your takes and doing all of that. You have to make sure that you itemize and organize all of that.
Yeah, and let me talk to producers directly. Do not have anybody cut before that is done. It is a huge, one of the biggest wastes of time and money in the film industry, especially by amateurs, because you're always going to have to do it later, and it's going to take more time and money to do it later. It does
Yeah.
not matter what you have to get out the door. Take time to sync everything first. If you need a day, a specific day or something synced, and you want to do that first and then cut something, that's fine. But what you're doing when you cut something without the audio and do it back in, you're creating a lot of technical work that did not need to be done if you just do things in the right order. Post-production people and assistant editors know what they're talking about. Assistant editors are very high demand now, because people don't really appreciate the job, because it's boring and it's very technical, and they don't listen to uh, like the order that they ask things to be done. But it's very important to do things in a certain order, because if you cut something without the right audio and you're like, oh, I can hear them, so it's okay, I just want to see it. And you cut that and you're like, that's a great cut, but can we do something about getting a good audio in? That means every single shot that they put in there, and sometimes there can be hundreds of individual things, you have to put an in point, out point on the timeline, and an in point, find the same in point on your first clip that's synced with the other clip that's synced, which, depending on how you do everything, can be very difficult, or it could take 15 seconds. And then, so you have to find 4 in points and out points, and then do that for 100 clips. That can take a full day, where people can be doing something else, or you don't even have to pay them and they don't have to do anything, if you took the time and set it up normally the first day. So
Mhm.
anyway,
It
um,
all factors into that bottom line and to the efficiency of the process, and also your satisfaction with the process, right? Because you could, if it was something very intricate, say it's a montage, and you've based all of your shots on energy flowing in from here, energy swirling from here, energy coming up from here, and you've built all of that with this one key shot, and then you realize that the sound doesn't line up, well, then you've made that much more work for yourself in having to redo the edit because you didn't have the sound for the piece that you wanted.
Exactly. Um, and I should say too, just jumping to something more fun, you should same thing that you do for visuals. When you see a movie and you say, "I want my movie to look like that," that's beautiful, or that's the style that I want to feel. Do the same thing for sound. Is if it's a movie, if you already have like a visual movie in mind, or you're like, "This feeling of this movie is how I want my movie to be." Let's just take an easy example and say, "I really love how Eraserhead sounds." This is always my sound example because it's one of the most famous audio films. Um, Eraserhead, if you don't know it, is dark, it's grotesque, it's very experimental, and there's very crazy. We talk about room tone, but he did specific things with room tone. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but one thing they would do is stick a lav inside of a bottle. Have you ever seen
I
Eraserhead?
haven't.
So it's a David Lynch film.
Okay.
So if that helps where we're at,
Yes, that helps
but
me know
yeah.
why.
And it's the one that made him famous. And what he would do is for the built room tone afterwards, one thing that he did was put a lav inside of a bottle, put it in a bathtub, and run the water, and he recorded that. And so it has a lot of they were kind of experimenting, recording different kind of sounds like that for a month, and they ended up putting it in the film. So let's say you want it to sound like that. You're like, that has the right feel. Well, that's all built on sound. It's very easy. Let's say you want your film, the right feel is 13 going on 30. Well, go watch the movie and skip through it even and pay attention a little bit to sound. Is that something that you like? It's good to give those examples the same way that you do communicate with the cinematographer. Even those little bits of things
Mhm. And
are very
definitely
important.
when you rewatch that, look for me receiving the bulldog from Mark Ruffalo. I think that was my very early stand-in days, and they put me in to this one thing, and I received the bulldog. It's a fun day in 90 degrees in Central Park.
Oh
So
wow.
Easter egg, look for my face as a young cheerleader with braids.
Well, that's
Oh,
fun.
what a time to be alive. Very silly.
I didn't know.
Speaking of taking an off ramp and
Yeah.
rambling.
No, that's cool. Um, yeah, and I would say too, like, as a producer, make sure that you have room for that. As a director, make sure that you're talking about that, because sound is a supportive role. It doesn't always take prominence, and all the sound people I work with, they're like, you don't want to work in sound or whatever. We're the you know we're the redheaded stepchild, and you know I we all like redheaded people, but we know what that we know what that saying means. Um, I get told
Yes.
that a lot by this one guy who I work with. So it's
Doesn't
kind of
get
the
enough of the
last,
attention. Yeah, it's left
yeah,
outside to its own
yeah, and
devices. Yeah.
so if you pay a little bit of attention, it goes a long way, and it can really change a lot about what how your sound people like working with you, you know.
Yes.
And that can bring costs down too, if you're fun to work with, that goes into bids. So um, I would say the other thing too. So we talked a bit about sound design. Let's just go a little bit further, and then we'll kind of jump into music a little bit.
Great.
Um, so the sound design again is for the auditory space that you're in. So it's really what you're building around whatever you want to hear. Is there magic in your film? What does that magic sound like? It's not just what does it look like, but how does that sound? You can almost hear the bells tinkling in your head as soon as somebody says magic and you talking
Yep.
about cinema, right?
Mhm.
Um, so like I'm actually working on a magic film right now, and I'm going to do the sound design for a portion of it, and those are the things that we're talking about in pre-production. Um, you want to and for animation, I should say too, you're starting from nothing, right? There's no room that you went to record from. There's maybe voices, maybe not, that you might have, but everything that you see on screen, inherently animation is making those things move.
Mhm.
Animation, motion graphics. When you see something move and you don't hear a sound, what moves and doesn't make a sound? A ghost.
Right.
So it feels, like I said, ethereally otherworldly. And so if you don't think about how to add the sound, what that room might sound like, even if your room is a pink wall with some static in the background or whatever, how can you make that feel like a real place, even if it is imaginary? Um, are they a lot of things that people add? Well, for pilots, I won't go into like specific stuff as much. But if you have an animation in your pilot, you want to put some time into sound design. Animations really can feel empty without some of that.
That's why it Foley becomes so important, that there are artists that create the sound of the thing that you couldn't go practically get at the top of a mountain, but we can create what we think that sound would be like in a room
Mhm.
with these practical tools, right?
Exactly. And Foley artists are helpful because a lot of times your library has a lot of things, but you might want to create something specific. It might be easier to sync everything up, uh, acting it out, especially footsteps are done a lot that way. Um, but you have to have a good facility and a very quiet room to record these separate things. So you don't have you're not dealing with the fridge or whatever. They're in very,
Mhm.
very quiet rooms where they record the um, Foley. Um, and that's great if you have that kind of budget for a pilot or whatever with your TV show. You very likely will be doing that. Um, the other thing that you can think about too is the very, very visual things that you have. If you have a sword fight in your film, um, you're going to want to hear the clinking of the swords. One of my favorite sound design things I ever heard was in The Departed.
The
When they take out.
Departed is how you pronounce
Oh, yeah,
that. It's The Departed.
totally messed up.
I'm from
Um,
there, so I can
I'm
say
from the yeah, I'm from Minnesota, exactly. Um, I'm not an actor.
It's okay, it's
We'll let
okay.
Nikki take it away.
Sorry. So,
No, it's
I'm
cool.
gonna translate. In the movie The Departed, which stars all of Alec
Yeah,
Baldwin and, Matt Damon and all these folks.
yeah,
Um,
I think you wanna think about I think obviously Scorsese's an amazing filmmaker, but one thing that I noticed, and I don't know if this is exactly right, but every time they take out their cell phone, it almost sounds like a sword unsheathing, and
Interesting.
that's, like, their communication weapon. I mean, you don't always have to do the exact sound, and I'll tell you that I almost never do the exact sound um, that you might see in the room. It's easier a lot of times, but a lot of times instead of doing, and when you do Foley too, you might not have the exact thing in the room, but you're getting something that sounds similar. So you can think about those things. What is the important thing that you see on screen, or what's the important thing that you need to hear in the background? If you're on a farm but you didn't show the farm, you might want to add in some chickens or a cow mooing every once in a while, or something that makes you feel that you're there. Um,
Mhm.
um, that's like easy, fun stuff to do, and that's the kind of stuff. Like even if you don't have a cheap pilot, those things are important to put you in, because if you don't have the sounds of a farm and you're telling the story of a lifelong farmer, something's missing. Something about being there isn't right, since you can't put, we don't all do smell-o-vision, so you can't put that manure smell, with your film.
Right.
uh,
We're not there yet, but maybe we will be. Who knows?
that's right. um so yeah, that's kind of fun. I love doing that kind of stuff.
I
It's
think it
cool.
also having those conversations, this is what it comes down to, is that as many of the conversations you can have with your post-production team in pre-pro or production
Hmm.
is going to cinch that time, is also going to say we're talking about the style. You don't want to go to them
Hmm.
and say we shot this practically, but we want this, and then somebody has to kind of try to make that shore up, right? Having those
Yeah, it's
conversations in advance.
it's it's having communication, and that's the hard part about being a director. Even though it's fun, you're relaying your vision 1,000 times to 1,000. I'm, I'm using hyperbole, but many different departments that you have, and you have to communicate to all those departments, and they can all equally add to your story. And since sound is such an integral part, people often leave it out because the visuals are very, very difficult and very expensive to do. Sound is expensive, but it's a lot more expensive if you don't talk about it ahead of time. That's for sure.
It's a great way to
Um,
put it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, don't underestimate how long it takes to do a sound mix. If you do have to do a sound mix for your pilot, or if you're finishing a TV show in general, or releasing it on the web, or whatever, number one, there's different kind of mixing for the web versus the theater. So you want to talk to your mixer about what they can do. A lot of times it doesn't take them a lot of time to switch between the two. I can often get, for the same price, mix for the theater and one for the web, or they might add on, a little extra fee to do that. But to do, let's say, the fastest that we've done, like a half an hour show, when we were on Axios, they would do sound in like 2 to 3 days to do a half an hour show. That is lightning fast, and we only did it because it was a news show, and it was properly finished. Like HBO stuff always sounds really nice, and they have great people doing it. But normally for you want to have at least 2 weeks for like an hour mix, maybe a little longer if you really have time for the episodes. So it takes a long time because there's a lot of different parts of the final sound mixing. First, you clean up the dialogue. It's called dialogue editing. You might have heard of that. They're basically making sure that all the words are enunciated well, that all the ends of words end at the right time, that they're not hearing extra room noise and room reverberations. Every different room has different reverberations because when the sounds bounce off the walls and everything, it sounds different in every room. Those reverberations are often recreated in post-production. That's reverb, by the way. Reverb and echo are similar. So you also have, if you have time for sound design, if you are doing ADR, that stuff all takes extra time and extra money and different people. About a third of the time, if you're just doing dialogue editing and mixing, it takes twice as long to do all the prep to set up the project as it does to do the actual mix. So just when you go to post, that's something to kind of keep in mind.
And I think that underlines the idea that when you want it to be good, it's going to cost you something, whether that is the time for the budget that you have. It's going to take more time to cut it at this rate because it will not be the top of your editor's list, or your sound mixer's list, or it's going to cost you a good amount to have the quality of person who can execute it with their team very quickly. So what you were saying in terms of indie versus the HBO team or the Axios team, right? You're paying top dollar for lightning speed, or you're paying what we can pay at this rate for it to take however long it needs to take.
Well, and that specific show is like HBO money. You're paying top people to do things, basically staying up. They basically stayed up 24 hours, 2 or 3 people really hammering this out. And they would get, a couple hours of sleep on the weekend. And so that means that their next day is shot for sure. They have to recover from intense work session like that. And so that's very, very expensive. If you're releasing online or whatever, just know that you can't set your release date before you get the sound back. You're going to want to listen to it, have review sessions, especially if you're doing it long distance, as a lot of people are now. You can get a lot cheaper things, but you need more time to do it because they're going to send it back. You have to sync it up and watch it down, send them back notes. If you can go and do a final studio mix, I mean, for almost everything in post-production, the last approvals process goes way faster when you do it live and in person. So that includes for a sound mix. And that can mean it might be better to pick a sound mixer who's closer by and costs a little bit more, just so you can go in and listen to their mix and make real-time changes. Not real-time changes with them, but they can do the final, little tweaks that you want in the final mix down while you're in the room, rather than sending files and stuff.
Absolutely.
So The other thing that you want to think about when you do a mix, whether it's, a pilot that your editor might be mixing, or while you're building the sound design, or for a final mix that's going to go on a platform of some kind. Um, you don't want to overstate sound effects or music. They're both sound is supporting, except for dialogue is number one, like the most important thing to a lot of storytelling. Um, as obviously, show like Clerks, most reality shows, you need that dialogue. You need dialogue in a sitcom. That's like what you come to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so don't overstate music or sound effects, even if you love what they are. Put them down and make sure that dialogue comes for what is the most important thing that you need to hear in the scene, and make sure that is heard before you add all this flourishes. Um, so when adding music, it's the same kind of idea, and music is obviously really fun to work with. And so let's just talk about how you might want to go through choosing music for your piece. A song or a score is like an easy cheat to get emotion. Human beings really react a lot to music. It can create a lot of different emotions, whether it's being agitated from a sound that you don't like, or something pleasing that can put you to sleep, or bouncy, happy music. Um, um, it's often music is replicated from what you've already seen in cinema or already done. Um, for an example that pops into a lot of people's heads is the Apple commercials. They used a ukulele, and it was wildly successful because Apple's good at branding. Um,
Mm-hmm.
for 10 years after that, ukuleles were in bank commercials and whatever else as well.
Yeah.
So that when it's used the same thing a lot of times, it can start to get watered down and not have it can start feeling cheesy. So it's really important to take time to think about what kind of mood do you want for your music when you're communicating with a composer, or you're placing your own temporary music, or whatever music. You want to enhance the feeling that's already there. You're not imposing a feeling of something else that you saw. You kind of have you whether you've created it first or using adding the music bed later. You really have to know what the core of your piece is about um, before you're picking music. Music all the time is also very numbing. You don't want to just um, you can't have the most emotional part of the film and in every scene. It just doesn't work. You need to give people a break, and because we react so strongly to music, when it comes from an absence, it can be very strong. One huge example is "Portrait of a Lady on Fire." If you haven't seen that, I think it's one of the best uses of music that I've ever seen in my life.
Mm.
Um, they don't have music for the majority of the film, and when it comes in, it's huge. The few times that it does.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, it underscores emotional energy. It can
mhm.
contrast emotional energy if somebody is lying, and you're playing something that's kind of screeching violins while they're smiling and happy and trying to get away with the lie that they're telling. Can be very striking, that difference, but it needs to be intentional.
Exactly, and it can be very different for the kind of mediums that you're in too. I should say, specifically for nonfiction and documentary. When you're trying to, obviously for reality, you might want to be a little corny. You might want to use more stereotypical stuff. For comedies, a lot of time, I mean, you think of Looney Tunes, they play classical music, things that everybody knows, and they're playing off of those jokes. Um,
Mhm.
Whereas documentaries, you might want to find something more neutral, because people really don't like to be manipulated when they watch a nonfiction show, because they believe that it's nonfiction. They don't want you to put this feeling on them. Although you often are doing that and you're supporting it, you might want to be a little more cautious with the emotional side of things when you choose a documentary.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
and
documentary, if it's animal related, is the only time where I feel like that's when we start to add some characters where hippos have, trombones and bodum bodum kind of things that That's a very musical answer from a musical person. But is what hippos do. But
Oh yeah, for sure.
that they start to add some whimsical character, even though because the animals aren't talking, obviously, unless they do for you, in which case we have a different problem. But if your animals are not talking, then there's some sort of communication that you are or energy capture that you're trying to say. Oh, this is a funny moment between the mother bird and the baby bird, or whatever that is. They're trying to create an energy that's going to contrast with something more dangerous later. And that's the only time where I feel like you do sort of get manipulated, where it becomes a little more cartoonish if they're trying to not give you the exact moment of the wild, but they're trying to create characters within that narrative.
Yeah, and it really is like, what kind of movie are you trying to do? Because I mean, there's this famous documentary. It's called Fistful of Quarters, King of Kong. Uh, it is about video game competition, um, and like who's the best. And they play the same song that's in the Karate Kid in there. You're the best around,
Oh
and it's
yeah,
really funny, and it adds to the story. And so it really depends on what you're doing. But if you obviously if you're doing something on wartime and it's a very political documentary, people have strong feelings about political documentaries. If you're using manipulative music and something like that, it's um it can really put half the audience aside, or it can feel like you're not being honest with the audience, and that's not good.
absolutely. Well, and I think too, there's also themes that can happen where, say, if there's something you're seeing tangentially in a documentary, it might be that if your character is the lead, we get more heroic music with you, but we get more quirky music with this other interaction, that it starts to be thematic, that you sort of
Yeah,
either have an instrument that we hear anytime we think of your character. There's
yeah,
multiple ways.
and those are ideas like, whether you have ideas as a director or producer or whoever you are, um, if you hire uh, a music editor, they have a lot of ideas for that. Those are things that you want to talk about. Do you want to have those kind of themes? Composers, those are definitely the conversations that they want to have. And you don't have to know anything about music to have anything about music theory or have ever played an instrument to talk about music with a composer. I think a lot of people are very nervous about that. I have a lot of music background, um, and you just have to talk more about the mood. It's just like you would with any other department. You don't have to worry about those kind of things. But one thing that I will say, is I learned a lesson very early when I was making movies in middle school and high school. I was doing a lot of war things for like for history class, and so I thought, put in really really intense music because that's what I think war is like, right? But I wasn't really paying attention to the scene and the tone of the scene and the mood of the scene, which is what you should be more talking about, because the piece that I was doing wasn't that intense, and it felt awful when I finished it, even though I like, this is my favorite song and this is what I want to throw in there, and this is my favorite artist in high school. Um, People do that kind of stuff all the time, and they're just like, they saw something else and they put the same kind of music in there. It's more thinking about having conversations about whether you're choosing the music or somebody else, about the tone and the kind of style that where you want to put things. Um, I mean, I can go into a million examples of different films, but you know, that's just.
Well, because it does have its energy almost like it's its own character.
Hmm.
That's the times when in a musical the character will burst into song when their emotion is so high. So maybe that's the key to how you use it. Or maybe when there are silences, that's when the music is doing the conversation or leading the conversation. So it's all, like you're saying, an artistic choice of how to use silence, how to use, or the absence of
Music.
music or
Yeah.
intentional sounds.
Yeah.
And because even silence isn't nothing. I mean, they do that
Yeah.
sometimes if there's either a ringing, if there's a bomb has gone off, that what's the sound, or what's the lack of sound, or what's that? Is it tinnitus?
Yeah.
That sound in your ear when you can't hear anything else and everyone's kind of in a fishbowl. Those are all creating an element of an auditory experience for the audience.
Exactly. And I think the thing to think about music is it's really an art form where you can speak emotionally, and professional musicians know how to do that. It is the universal language. People get a feeling from certain types of music. Not saying everybody feels the same way about all music. Obviously, that's not true. You just say heavy metal, and you could know people who like it and people who don't. Um, but it's a choice when you put it into a film. Um, so I think the other thing too that's very important, and this is the good thing about when you're making a pilot, is you need to know your budget and what you're gonna be doing when you're placing music. Okay, so if you don't have a composer on, obviously if you have a composer on, you're gonna talk about your budget with them. If you don't and you're placing music, a lot of times you're placing temporary music. Um, that can a lot of times be big trouble if you can't license the music afterwards. Not saying that you should never do it, um, but it is difficult if you fall in love with something and you're saying, composer, create this exact mood. Well, they can't copy it exactly, so it's going to be different. You also might be putting in something with a full orchestra, and they can only pay for 4 instruments for your film. You have a string quartet. That's not going to sound the same, no matter
Mhm.
if they write the perfect composition for it. You don't have the same kind of power that you might with a full orchestra, for example.
Mhm.
Um, so when you're picking songs, even temporary songs, it might be better to make them sound worse at the beginning, and then you can fix them at the end if you have a composer. Um, that being said, if you're making a pilot and you're going to an executive, you're trying to create something from nothing, right? This isn't going to be seen by anybody except for these executives. Well, if that's the case, you don't have to license anything. You can use any music in the world. You can use Radiohead if you want in your pilot. You could use the Beatles, and you're not going to have to pay a cent because it's a private showing. You're nothing's outward facing. So like when we pitched Axios, I know I used Quincy Jones in that. Like that we didn't have a budget for that. We didn't even mix it.
Right.
So um
And
but
there's
I
no
know
income for that screening. You're not being paid for people to see it. Therefore, you're not making money off of someone's IP.
exactly. Exactly. I mean, it might turn into something, but once it starts going out facing, I mean, you might be making money if it sells, but that's
Sure.
just they know that that's going to be changed once it's outward facing.
Right.
Um, and that's the thing to talk with the executives. Obviously, if you want to get your buddy who's a musician into the show, and you think it's a good fit for the show, that might be even better. That way, you already have that arrangement ahead of time, something like that. Um,
Do you need a license for someone to, not a license, but does someone have to have the right to cover something? If you
oh
say,
yeah.
I love my friend
Do you
does a
want to
really
go?
great rendition of this, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe we should go through the legal aspects of music, using music. So there's 2 licenses that you have to get to show anything. One is the whoever wrote the song, and the other one is whoever performed the song. So I actually have a blog. Probably won't go through all of this. There is a blog on our a Fourwind website, fourwindfilms.com, that talks about licensing music that I just published last year, but that has some examples. But generally you have to pay the people who performed it and the people or the recording, whoever owns the recording. It's not always the people who performed it, but the people who own the actual recording of the performance, and which is often record labels, uh, a lot of times, and then whoever wrote it. So if, for example, I licensed a Woody Guthrie song. It doesn't matter if you don't know who he is, famous folk singer. I licensed the Woody Guthrie song for our last film, and my documentary subject performed it. Well, my documentary subject said we can use that. Well, that doesn't really matter. It's good, then I don't have to pay the performance right, the recording rights, but you still have to get the rights for the person who wrote it. And so we had to write to Woody Guthrie's estate and get a separate deal in place for the publishing rights, is what you call it. So you always have to get 2 rights for it. That being said, it can be very complicated. People often do very different pricing depending. Musicians withhold their prices because they'll adjust to get as much money out of you as they can, because they don't know what's going on. So they ask a lot of questions ahead of time.
Hmm.
And it also depends where you're going. You can get partial rights. Let's say if you agree, you can have film festival rights for a year is often what people want to do. And they're like, we'll worry about things later. That means you can only show at the film festival for a year, and then you have to get the rights again, or pay again an additional fee. If it goes to broadcast television and you just pay for broadcast television rights, you might have to get it for other things. You can get worldwide rights. There's often two parts to how you do music rights. There's the two separate contracts, number one, but then there's also in the contracts for each of those things, you're going to say, how long do you have those rights to use in your program? And usually it's defined that you only use it within that program. It has to be associated somehow with the program. And then what platforms are you allowed to put this on? Is it worldwide, which means any platform ever? Or is it just for television? Is it just for internet marketing or whatever? Those are really important things. The other thing that you'll talk about too is if you have a song in your film, you might not be able to use it for marketing purposes for like a trailer. So that's an additional discussion. Just because you got the music rights, both publishing and the master recording rights for something in your film, you might not be able to use it for your trailer. You have to get that in a contract.
Hmm. It's very
So,
intricate in that way. And just for anybody who doesn't know, the same is somewhat true in terms of art. If there's a piece of art on your
mhm.
wall that, is from uh, Bed Bath and Beyond, it's slightly different than if there's an original art piece on the wall. You are supposed to have a clearance before you show someone else's art in that way. So it's always key to make sure you're paying attention to those things when you're location scouting.
Definitely. Yeah. And you never know when they're going to come after you. But the music people will definitely, if you're making money, and especially if you get picked up if you're going for television or something big, they're going to take that money from you. If you go on YouTube and you're using rights that are in all these libraries, I mean, I'm sure people have seen, your movie is now making money for those artists and the people who own the rights to those songs. You're
Right.
not making money on that anymore. So that's really important things to think about. But obviously, if you're going in to pitch to an executive, use whatever you want. Just because you can use the Beatles, though, doesn't mean you should. The Beatles are very distracting. Everybody knows them. Everybody knows exactly. They might know the lyrics. They might stop paying attention to things. Oh, and that's one other
Right.
thing too. Before we run out, songs with lyrics are very powerful. If the lyrics don't match what you're seeing, um, it can be a big issue. That includes sometimes when it's in another language. People understand languages that you don't, so you can that can be an issue. The other thing is if there's lyrics under a dialogue, those things compete a lot.
Right.
People a lot of times will pay attention to the singer more than somebody who's speaking, and you never know where your audience is going to go. So it's always good to get instrumental pieces.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know that we're almost at an hour. We have
Sure. We can keep going.
a couple other things, but I'll just go quickly, like kind of different things that I do for finding music. I'm always gathering files. I know a lot of people listen on Spotify. If you keep your files, if you're cutting pilots and pitches, if you like a score, a lot of editors keep other scores that they like because they know it works well under people talking. There's really cool, cheap stuff at there's a place with stock music. You don't have to pay very much. It can suffice for things, especially if you're putting online. And they have all the legal stuff worked out for $50 a lot of times.
Hmm.
And it's important with sound, with all of these things, before you go into an executive and pitch, or before you deliver something for a final thing, make sure that you're screening with other people and you're not the only one listening. It's just as important for sound as it is for storytelling to make sure that people can understand the same things you do. We had an example, one of the last projects I worked on. We had somebody who had, she had can't remember exactly she was in prison, and she had an issue with her brain, and she didn't talk as normal as everybody else. And working on the project for a long time, you're in post production, you start to understand everything that that person is saying. But a lot of the people who are watching your stuff, watching it for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things that, if you have those issues it, for like a pilot, and you're deciding whether or not to get a mix done, issues like that, the mix can help. Also, you need to know where you need to put in subtitles or clarify things for the audience. They might not catch everything that you do.
It's equally important, as you're saying, to what we discussed on our last episode, which was for editing, that you need fresh eyes or fresh ears,
Hmm.
fresh audience to tell you what they're missing, what they got, what they didn't get, so that your edit gets its own audience and your mix gets its own audience, so that you're really tuning into one specific element to make sure that everything is clarified in the way that you intend.
Yeah, and it's the first. I mean, the first thing people always ask, if we started off by saying the first thing that you can tell is amateur in a film is sound. That's the first comment that they're going to say after, if you do a screening. Oh, are you going to fix that sound? Then you better fix it before you go to an executive. I'll tell you that.
Oh
If
yeah.
anybody says anything about your sound, do something about it. Or at least give a disclaimer ahead of time. This is bad, but we put up subtitles so you can understand. I apologize for this, or otherwise, cut it out. um, the other thing too is, like, when you're creating sound and you're like building stuff up, and you are working on it, everything can be thrown away at any moment. You sound, again, is often the last thing that you think about, but a lot of times you overbuild the sound, because some people have a lot of great ideas, and in the end, you might cut back in certain places.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, don't be precious with anything in sound. Again, it's a supportive role. It's important, but it's, again, supportive. Um, think about, and just to end up, trying to wrap this quickly. I don't think we'll go into as much about. We kind of did the sound mix stuff before. I think, in general, when you are creating sound and talking about sound with your team, you want to think about tension and resolve. Where's the climax? How can we enhance that through sound? When is the best time to add music? When do you feel like you need something? I always do it when I'm like, I miss music right now in the film. I want to put it in. So
Yeah.
that's like a good way to go. If you don't like a lot of music, then don't do it just because somebody tells you to put it in. Do what you like, but think about it. Then think about also important stuff, and a lot of hard things to do in the editing room is transitioning into different scenes and to different moods. A lot of that can be solved through sound. If you look at the show like Friends, or like sitcoms, I just use that because I've been watching it a lot. They have that quick guitar lick in between every scene. That, quick transition. You're refreshed, your palate is cleansed, and you're ready to see another, you know, two friends in a room chatting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other thing, things that can change you to another scene and move you. Let's say if you're in a documentary or even outside on CSI murder scene. If you have a car pass in the background and you hear that kind of drift into the next scene, that kind of bridges the two scenes together. If you see a door slam in a prison cell, boom, you're out of there and you can jump somewhere else. So really think about those to help. If you feel like things aren't transitioning enough, how can you have sound take something off of your visual edit in order to transition?
Using it as
So
an accent and to help transition and to help set up or shift. It's a transition. One of the things I was curious about, do you find yourself being asked to do a separate mix for the festival run versus a screening, in the same way that people would do a DCP version? The way that the light shines through on the internet is different than the way that the light is projected at the screen. Sometimes there are different color edits for those two things. Is that true for sound?
Well, it's way more true for sound. Color is complicated. I mean, it's getting more complicated, but sound is really, and people have been writing a lot of articles about this recently. And there's like a popular, I mean, I'm in a couple sound groups, and there's this one explainer video that's on YouTube somewhere. I don't know what it's called, but um, everybody is listening. I have these nice studio speakers to the right and to the left of me. Right now we're listening on headphones. A lot of people listen with earbuds on the train. A lot of people have really bad speakers that are in really thin TVs that are, in the middle of the room. It's not really surrounding you.
Mm-hmm.
People have those sound bars, and all of these things sound very different, especially from in the theater. If you go to the Chinese theater and you have the Atmos, I mean, that place sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Um, um, those are very, very different things. And you can almost mix for all of those separate things. Obviously, you can't do a mix for everybody's separate speakers. There's a million different ways that people will listen. But for the theater, because the environment's very controlled, you have, and the speakers are really good, they have a lot wider range to play with. So their quieter quiets can be heard versus the loud parts. When you get to like internet stuff and things are coming out of a laptop, you have a lot smaller range to work with. So
Mm-hmm.
the main two mixes that I do, aside from stereo and 5.1 right now, I would say for deliverable for television and for pilots and stuff, don't worry about anything 5.1. If you're playing in a theater, you can worry about other kind of mixes. Stereo, even mono is okay for a lot of stuff. Sorry, and then the two different kind of mixes that you might need is one for a theater or TV, which might have if you're delivering for TV, they're going to give you specific specs, and you need to give those to your mixers. People who know what they're doing have done it a million times. There's very specific things to make sure that it sounds good on the platforms. Online, when you put it on YouTube, a lot of times the mixers that I work with, they'll give me one for the theater and for on YouTube. So I say those three kind of different level mixes are kind of a base to start from. Internet, television, which you're going to get the specs for, and then a theater mix.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because it's more experiential when it's all around you. Because not everybody listens with cans at home, which can do some of the spatial awareness stuff that many of us are consuming just looking at our phones or looking at our laptops, which is, like you said, more condensed, more compressed,
Yeah.
with less range, dynamic range.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the dynamic range of the sound. So those are the main things to think about. But again, if you're going in for a pitch and not finishing, just make sure that it's audible and support everything else is supportive of the story, and think about tone and mood with music and everything. Don't overuse music. Don't overuse sound effects. Dialogue is always very likely the most important thing in your story. So
Absolutely. Well, Justin, that's fantastic. Thank you. It's a great primer into the essentials of sound and how to approach it on an indie budget, as well as the pitfalls to look out for. We always love having you here. We look forward to our next episode. Did we decide what the next one's going to be yet?
yeah, I have it written this time, so we remember
Oh, good.
animation, color, and compositing. So
Ooh,
it's a it's
animation, color, and compositing.
it's a three-legged pillar of
I'm
post.
down. It's a three-legged pillar. It's a tripod of a pillar, if you will. Picture that in your minds. So we'll have you back for that soon. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And we look forward to having you back.
Always a pleasure. And I should just say quickly, if you guys have any questions, feel free to write us at Quatre-Vents post.com. There's a question section, or otherwise write to Nikki at Catalyst, and she can forward them to me or something. I don't know.
Yes, you can write to Story Road, STORIE Road at catalyststories.com, and it shares an ST, so it's catalyststories.com.
Oh, yes.
That's not too complicated. I will hear from you there and pass your messages on to Justin. Thank you, Bodhi, for watching and engaging with us, and thank you all. We'll see you next time.
All right.